All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Braxton Shelley, Professor of Music, Sacred Music, and Divinity at the Yale Divinity School. He's the author of Healing the Soul, Richard Smallwood, The Vamp, and the Gospel Imagination, published by Oxford University Press, 2021. And he joins us today to talk about his latest book, An Eternal Pitch, Bishop G.E. Patterson, and the Afterlives of Ecstasy, published by University of California Press. Of An Eternal Pitch, Duke alum Marla Fredericks writes, uniquely groundbreaking in its analysis of media, Pentecostalism, and Black preaching, An Eternal Pitch reimagines the ways in which sonic techniques shape our relationship to spiritual and material worlds. Shelley's deft theoretical interpretation of Bishop Patterson's homiletic Afterlife is a must-read, technical masterpiece for those interested in how broadcast religion has touched the lives of millions and reshaped the culture's relationship to the divine. How are you doing today, Professor Shelley?
I'm doing great. Can I tell you how honored I am to be here with you on this venerable format across which so many have passed? I'm doing well. I'm really excited to talk about some of the work I've spent a lot of time thinking about.
Welcome home, of course.
Oh yes, always good to be back in Durham and on the campus of Duke. I owe so much to this institution. So,
thank you. So I want to start G.E. Patterson, right? And the only reason I knew who he was, as I imagine is for many Americans, was the Sunday morning broadcast on BET.
In Memphis, Tennessee, and from auditoriums across America, we present the Bountiful Blessings broadcast with Bishop G.E. Patterson.
Our mission is to reach the universe of mankind with the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ.
And my wife was a big fan, right? You know, I've never been, I won't say that I haven't been religious, but you get it, right? She was the one who wanted to be able to watch church services on Sunday mornings. So Patterson would come on and, you know, he was phenomenal, right? Even when I wasn't paying attention, I was like, okay, this guy's a good preacher.
He saw healing as correcting those inequities that Satan had brought about in the midst of God's creation.
The other context for me in G.E. Patterson, I'm a New York guy, love New York radio. When I left New York now 30 years ago, one of the ways I stayed connected to New York was listening to AM radio. And in particular, there was a station called WFAN, which was an all sports radio station, except drive time in the morning from 7 to 10, which was the Don Imus show.
Oh, yes.
And Don Imus loved him.
Some
G.E. Patterson, right? To the extent that when G.E. Patterson died in 2007, the bishop's wife came on, you know, he played extended versions. And I always wondered to myself, it's like, what was it about G.E. Patterson that it would get someone even like Don Imus to be engaged? And you wrote the book to tell us why G.E. Patterson was so significant.
Well, in a way, this book comes out of my own quest to make sense of it. I grew up listening to G.E. Patterson in the living room of my grandmother of sainted memory.
I'm bought with a price. I'm yours, Lord. Everything I've got, everything I am, everything I'm not, I'm yours. Try me now and see if I can be completely yours. Everybody standing on your feet.
As a kid, you know, I was a church musician, so I was in church all the time, and the preaching he was doing was of a different caliber than some of the preaching I was hearing. But I was gripped by his imagination, right? Yeah. By the way that scenes described in the Hebrew Bible, right, just seemed to come like urgently and contemporarily, like through the screen as he was talking about him. And that was, like when I was 9, 10, 11, 12. Once I was in graduate school, sort of starting my first book, I kept just sort of having side conversations with saintly old church ladies. Some were Baptist, some were AME Zion, some were AME. None of them were dyed-in-the-wool Pentecostals.
Right.
None of them had a lot of respect for most televangelists.
Right.
Over and over, I kept hearing the phrase almost verbatim. The only televangelist I watch is that G.E. Patterson, right? And so part of what got me was trying to understand this ecumenical appeal, right? The kind of black ecumenism that like his preaching seemed to summon, because he was unabashedly Pentecostal.
Right.
He'd be speaking in tongues. He'd be talking about, we don't have the abracadabra Holy Ghost. We have the Holy Ghost you had to tarry for, And, but still, folks who were not of his tradition found him to be the bearer of a deeper tradition, right?
Yeah.
And so the best I can say is that I feel like Patterson was uncommonly able to be a 20th and early 21st century example of a griot, right? Like I think he really did imbibe and then was able to re-articulate and reanimate tradition. Some of it's a quality of mind thing. He had to have had a photographic memory. He would just be talking in 2 Samuel down around verse so-and-so and whatever. And then he'd start pulling out, Zerubbabel, the governor of so-and-so, and Shealtiel, and, like these names, like these were his first cousins that he knew. And of course, they were not his cousins, at least not first cousins. And so something about the quality of mind and then the quality of voice, right? The instrument was just unusual, like the range, but the power he was able to access from the very bottom range to the very top, and the versatility of it. If you listen to some of what he does, like he is as agile as any operatic singer or blues singer or anybody any day. So combining all those things made, I think, for a life of ministry that, as his book says, the Afterlives title, people have had a hard time letting go of it, right? And have worked to keep Patterson alive in a certain way, and that's the other piece that's fascinated me.
You mentioned early in the book that years ago, 2 decades ago, you had heard a run from Patterson, right? And, there's no, Google isn't what Google is now. There's no YouTube yet.
Right.
But you're sitting around in 2020 listening to Patterson and you hear that run again.
Right.
And it actually opens up the space for you to think about writing this book, which you hadn't been thinking about writing, at least not at this time.
Right.
Talk a little bit about, because this is the thing that's so fascinating about Patterson. I mean, there's a way to argue, it's almost Malcolm X-like in this sense, that he may be far more well-known in death because of the technology than he ever was when he was alive. So talk a little bit, if you could delve a little deeper into this idea of the afterlives. What you describe as the afterlives of ecstasy in the title of the book. Right.
Well, this is something I've really struggled to understand. And I mean, I've been helped in thinking about some of the, titular figures in Black studies, thinking about the afterlives of slavery, thinking about what, Shanna Redmond did with Paul Robeson's afterlife. And so those were important sort of scholarly precedents to give me a language to kind of talk about what I was seeing and sensing. One of the things that most grips me is looking at like a 18, 19, or 20-year-old, Black preacher musician on TikTok, right? Sharing a Patterson clip as if, Patterson hadn't been dead for almost all of their life.
Right.
And so, but there is a certain kind of familiarity that comes out of the just pervasiveness of the presence online, And the TV broadcast still airing on the Word Network, and there are still some local stations where the TV broadcast airs. His radio station is on right now, And I can pull it up on my phone because G. Patterson was one of the early radio stations to go online in the late 90s because he was a technophile of the highest order, right? You know, from the 1950s onward, he was preoccupied with technological innovation. So he was on dial-a-prayer phone lines, you know, like the kind of stuff a white Pentecostal like R.W. Schembach was doing in Indiana. He was doing that in the 50s, in the 60s. I found, you know, when I was doing my sort of archival work, I found ads in the Kojic Bulletins from the 63 where he was talking about, you know, this voice can be heard 24/7 on the church's dial-a-prayer line, right? Which is a very interesting kind of, I don't know if you want to call it like media prophetic or media archaeological, right? To think that he was always after the kind of vocal omnipresence that is available now. And so even if he couldn't have fathomed the devices and the infrastructures and the apparatus that are the like engine of his afterlife, he was always after something like it. And this is, you know, I mean, we can even talk Afrofuturist. There are so many like ways to do this because whatever it is, it's an incredibly black thing, you know, like that he was after and about both the musicality at the level of the individual sermon and this sort of broader imagination, the kind of, you know, refusal of what you call, you know, the sort of the unfortunate ephemerality of so much of black culture. I see Patterson's life work and especially the afterlife as a kind of ongoing affront against a certain kind of black ephemerality, or viewing blackness as an answer to certain kinds of ephemerality, certain kinds of limitations that then also, you know, finally have this theological dimension to it, right? Like, you know, if the word is supposed to be eternal, then how can you make that that sort of confessional tenet something that's available for experience? And I think that's the other thing he was trying to do, is to make this word that he claimed had eternal power, right? Like eternally available.
You talk about in the book how, from his purview, right, because he loved, fascinated by technology, that he saw every aspect of technology as really a medium for his message, right? In the most literal sense, the microphone, the camera, right? All these other kind of technological advancements he saw in that way. But you also compare him to some of the earlier televangelists. I was struck, for instance, the conversation that you have about Oral Roberts, and Oral Roberts trying to translate his signature tent services into a television studio, and it doesn't work, right? So he has to bring the technology into the tent, and then he also has to, you know, convince the congregation not to pay attention to all of this, right? I think about watching that film of Amazing Grace.
Oh yeah.
And listening to James Cleveland instruct the audience at the beginning, this is being filmed, right? You know, if you need to give into the Spirit, give into the Spirit, right?
She could have very easily have gone into a studio and done this album, but she wanted to do something live. And the only reason we want to do it live is to get the audience participation. So now those of you here got to sound like about 2000. Can you sound like 2000? Let me hear, come on. Right on.
Were there any precursors to what G.E. Patterson does with technology in that regard, right? And we know about the long tradition of Black preachers who use recorded music, record albums, records, who use radio. But is there really a precursor for what he did?
Well, you know, I would think about Charles Mason, Bishop Charles Harrison Mason, who founds Kojic.
Kojic, yeah.
And there's all this controversy. I'm probably gonna get in trouble as you've got such a big viewership, Mark. But you know, there's a picture in Yvonne Chirot's book, Black Magic, where Bishop Mason is surrounded by all these pictures of sort of God's handiwork, right? These sort of odd-shaped plants and roots and stems, right? And so the debate is Mason a root doctor, right? You know, and so there are all these very interesting, debates, where folks are like, absolutely, absolutely, black religion is syncretic if nothing else, right?
Right.
And then you have, very strong apologists, that stuff is pagan. and Bishop Mason was an exemplar of holiness, which means being set apart from that kind of thing. But I think if you think about there's a sort of scriptural tradition in the Acts of the Apostles where, fragments of an apostle's clothes are cut up and disseminated, right? This is where the tradition of prayer cloths comes from, right? The idea that like these things could become points of contact.
Right.
Oral Roberts is sort of known, given the benefits of whiteness and fame and resources, for claiming a lot of this. But again, that's to me is a very black thing, And so to me, what I call in the last chapter of the book, I call it the logic of the prayer cloth, right? Yeah. Which is this view that like these instruments can be taken up. And I think that what's so cool about Patterson is with these little riffs, like the one I remembered across 20 years, he uses sound as a medium in which he can stitch together these audible prayer cloths, right? And there's a church in New Haven, Kojic Church, that has in the back of the sanctuary, "Be healed, be delivered, be set free." One of the phrases he's famous for, right, is on the wall today, right? It's a audible fragment, right? And of course that is supposed to be an efficacious utterance, right? If you speak it. And so for me, it's efficacious in the same way that the prayer cloth is supposed to affect the healing. And so I think that in terms of precursors, more than a single individual, is this, this belief, right, that God can inhabit anything, right? And that these instruments can become conduits. And that is why, I say, like, as much as Patterson as anything else, he's a media theorist. Right? And that's, I guess, kind of one of my hobby horses that I'm on, even in the first book, right? I'm trying to say that black folks are great theorists, and that the vamp is a theory of what the world is, or the plurality of worlds, right? And their traversability through sound. And so I think Patterson, he's a technophile. Yeah, he loves the gadgets, but he's also theorizing what they can do, right? Yeah. And he has his own very sophisticated, successful 2 decades beyond the grave in terms of like what he came up with as his own, kind of media theoretic, that also has a homiletic dimension, a musical dimension, but what they share is the view. The sermon is a broadcast. And then the broadcast of the sermon is a broadcast of a broadcast, right? But this basic idea, right, that my job is to become what he prayed. I want to speak as an oracle of Christ, not just a man. That was the prayer he prayed before almost every sermon. And that request is kind of what I think motivates the sound, that at a certain point in the sermon, he got to stop being just a man and become the oracle, right? The oracle. And that oracular thing is him sort of instrumentalizing himself, his voice, in a way that allows him to activate the sort of affordances of the other instruments and devices that he surrounds.
You are clear in the book that this is not a biography of G.E. Patterson, right? So I have a couple of questions for you with regards to that. Did you ever have the opportunity to be in G.E. Patterson's company? And the second question is, how much access did you have to folks around him? Right, and I raise that question in that interesting way that folks who write about people who were living in their lifetime or might even still be living, there's a way in which actual contact with some of these figures actually has the impact of diminishing them, right, in your view, as opposed to enhancing them. How important was it for you to have access to people around him? Or did you need more distance in the way that you theorize around his life and his work? Yeah.
That's a great question and really methodologically important. For me, I never got to enjoy his presence physically, which is fine. Although I had a period where I felt like we were friends. You know, like in the early pandemic, I was just writing, listening to stuff. You know, we all thought we were going to die, so I was trying to get real saved.
Yeah.
And I was listening. I was listening to Patterson around the clock. I was listening to Patterson while I seasoned my chicken. Patterson while I did my little workout on the floor in the house. It was Patterson. I felt like we were friends. But I did have, you know, both a general kind of access and particular access. I gave a talk for the Hutchins Center during my first appointment at Harvard, and it was so funny. Somebody, the flyer for it, made its way to Memphis somehow, and I got an email from the chief of staff to Evangelist Louise Patterson, who's now since passed on, Patterson's widow, and she wanted to know how I was going to be representing her husband in this talk at the Hutchins Center. And I said, I think you'll be all right with it. And in the end, she watched it and called me.
Oh, wow.
And we had a number of conversations, very helpful in terms of getting rights and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then beyond that, I was able to have extended conversations with, you know, musicians and other folks, either who were directly of his employ or those who were very good friends of folks who were of his employ, because they could have even more distance to be able to talk about it. So I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the Memphis area, and so they just, you know, he was in a way the city, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like I got a good sense of his humanity. And actually, that's the thing that's interesting. You know, I could never appreciate it until the last year and a half watching, you know, a human life end up close.
Right.
What it's like to see what I watched when I watched all the videos of Patterson's last years, right? So I feel like he was also humanized by his valiant fight against illness and against the cancer. So I think. And in a way, you know, it's sort of like the whole idea of the vanishing mediator. He literally vanished, you know.
Right.
And in so doing, the parts of him that were most strong, you know, remained. And so I was so helped by his last sermon, where he, in the last minute and a half of his last sermon, he does the thing I call the eternal riff. He finds his way, dying of cancer, too weak to stand, but he finds his way to the tenor, be natural, because that's the note that is the eternal pitch, right?
I never shall forget when I was on my way down to a devil's hell. I wasn't fit to live. I was scared to die. But I heard somebody said, call him.
And, you know, he doesn't have perfect pitch, I say, but he does have eternal pitch. And so I think, so I feel like I got a sense of his humanity, even if I didn't get the kind of access to have long conversations with him.
Right.
And I think also what's really useful, as I said about the TikTok bros, right? Like who, you know, much of Patterson's significance now is built around folks who were not alive when he was alive, right?
Which is incredible.
And so I think in a way that distance kind of helps me to understand the work Patterson is doing now, right? The work Patterson is being used to do now, and it's just to thinking about it with this distance is, I think, really in a way connects me to some of Patterson's primary audience these days.
The subtitle of your book, you know, The Afterlives of Ecstasy, but the title of the book, Eternal Pitch, and you deploy pitch to think about G.E. Patterson in many different ways. Talk about how pitch functions in the context of the way that you theorize around Patterson's impact.
Right, well, there is that, you know, useful kind of polysemy, if you will, right, where pitch can be an angle. Pitch is a thing you do, right? You know, throwing a ball out. Pitch is a statement, right? You know, pitch is, in sort of music theoretic terms, a specific, you know, frequency, right?
Right.
And Patterson, what's so interesting for me is that he combines all of them, right? You know, whether we're talking about how quickly he rose to the heights of the Church of God in Christ, whether we're talking about the way he delivered and packaged his sermons, the slogans he wove into them, the musical sort of entities, the kind of pitch structures that he actually repeated the very last note of his preaching life. You know, that's the thing. I really couldn't believe it. I know you've had this experience writing 40 or so books as you have. I know you had the experience where you're like, nah, I'm just making this up. I can't believe it. You know, when the data just speaks to you. And when I was writing, I was like, there's no way. He keeps finding this one pitch over and over again. And, you know, in music theoretical terms, the key is supposed to direct the pitch, but he would find the pitch in different keys. And so that doesn't make musical sense, right? But it made, you know, I guess Sean would call it an otherwise sense, right?
Yep.
And so that to me was what was clarifying. I kept seeing if he was preaching in D, if he was preaching in E, if he was preaching in F sharp, if he was preaching in D flat, but he was going to get to that note unless it would be absolutely dissonant, right? And of course, you know, musically, right, it was about where it was in his body. Yeah. Like he knew there's a certain ring you get, right? And he had to get to that there, right? That there was a place he was trying to take his congregants to. And for me, I think that was his broadcast frequency. That was the place where he finally locked in. And the spiritual realm and the material world like came into a meaningful kind of unification. And people could hear it, and you could hear it because he was hearing it. Yeah. So that's why when he was talking about Jehoshaphat and Jehaziel and all these other folks, you thought you were there because it was like he was playing, you know, a long playing broadcast, you know, of that, and that he had done the work with his voice, you know. And I think this is one thing where I'm really jealous of folks who have a few decades on me, is because, you know, tech works so well. So now I never had to play with the radio, you know, except when it was broken, we had to kind of try to steal cable, we put some aluminum foil on the ears and you know, try to get the stuff in. But I never had to do that to, you know, but thinking about early radio, when it wasn't press a button, but it was like when connection was an achievement. Right. That's, to me, that's the kind of, that's his real technological you know, milieu, right? Like trying to tinker and turn and all right, we got it now. And that's sort of where the whole sermon was trying to get to that moment of breakthrough.
Whew, that is great. Had you not been trained as an ethnomusicologist, would Patterson have mattered to you?
I think Patterson would have mattered to me differently if I, you know, didn't have the training in the fields of music. I couldn't have written this book, right? Like, you know, without just the way the training trains you to think, right? Or the things you come to notice. But one of the points I want to make, and I do try to make in the introduction, you know, is that alongside Black people being great theorists, the non-musician church people I know are they really care about sound. You know, they know what they like, they know what they don't. I wrote an article entitled, I love it when you play that Holy Ghost chord, about this thing that's somebody at Mount Level up there in Northern Durham said to me once. And I thought it was so interesting. She called the chord the Holy Ghost chord, you know, like and she knew what she was talking about. She was talking about a diminished seventh chord on the Hammond organ with all the drawbars pulled out, which is about as dissonant and static a sound as you can get. She knew that she don't play nothing, she don't really sing, you know, but sound as the necessary conduit to the world that she takes to be more real than the material world is really important to her. And so I think, you know, Patterson's audience might not call it a riff. They couldn't tell me about the intervallic pattern necessarily in the language. They don't have the analytical meta language that I might bring to it. But people know what they like in Patterson, just like they know what they like in all kinds of artists. And so I do think actually the formality, or I call it the sort of the formalism of Black religion, you know, is, and you know it, everybody knows you're doing a gospel concert and you're in the major key, but when the song ends and the person starts doing that pentatonic thing and run the blues scale, that's when we know it's really church. And the band knows what to do. Nobody has to talk about it, right? Because we have imbibed the codes. And that formalism is, I just try to put it in language for the academy.
Yeah.
But the brilliance of it is the cultures.
To your point, when we hear critiques now, we listen to contemporary, I don't want to say black music, but let me specifically place it in genre.
I got you.
When we listen to contemporary R&B music, we can hear in these young folks who's ever spent any time in a choir and who's never set foot in a church, right? At least within the black Christian tradition. But the critiques that you hear of that aren't coming from church musicians. Those critiques are coming from lay folks,
right?
Who sat in the church and are like, this don't sound right. which is to your point, right? The audience knows what they hear. Right. They know what the sound means, and they know when it doesn't show up the way that it should. I got a speculative question for you.
Okay.
If Bishop Patterson doesn't die in 2007, and he's able to survive into a vastly different technological world that we're in now, how do you think he navigates the world of social media and handheld devices and Instagram? And we already have evidence of it because folks are doing that already, but how would he have navigated that?
It's interesting. And I do kind of play with that a little in the epilogue when I sort of say, if Patterson was running his media ministry and picking the 1 minute clip for the 1 minute sermon, I think he told you what it would be in the frame of his sermon where he does the riff or he does the pitch or whatever. Like, I feel like to a large degree, the what I call the broadcast grammar, right, of his sermons gives you a sense of how he would try to navigate because media is always about formatting, right? And so you have to make these decisions about how to exist in a given ecosystem with the constraints, right, that come with it. So I think Patterson, Patterson would have had a lot of fun in the pandemic. He would have the resources. He would have, turned his house into a studio.
Yep.
And he would have, preaching up something, and he would have been on it because I think he enjoyed it. That's one of the things that Ms. Patterson told me when we interviewed you. She's like, if you had been backstage at the church in the room, you would have thought it was CNN. The technology was just so advanced, right? And so this is, he was preaching, and so I could cite people, who have written about the studio, the role of the studio. Folks have done ethnography and stuff around the studio because Patterson was always preaching in the studio, like the pulpit was a cutting edge studio, right? And in the same way that studio work frames and influences and shapes and inspires the kinds of musical creativity that takes place in a live session, that's part of what was happening, right? And so I just think there are so many resonances. You got this person who thinks the sermon is a broadcast, right? A broadcast, he's trying to pick up spiritual power. Got all these cameras, all these mics. He's, concerned about the cameras being isolated. He's got his language about how to talk about these things. And then you do have he's repeating this trope he does all the time. And then he's got 300 duplicators in the room getting ready to literally technologically repeat what he just did today, right? There's just so many resonances, and academically we call them so many homologies, right? Between the different facets of this broadcast religion that it succeeds, right? Because it's brilliant, but it's not subtle. He's really clear about what he thinks the stuff can do. And I think with the assertiveness of, a half century, right? Like he set up a kind of momentum that is enduring into the present.
One of the critical moves that you make in internal pitch is to force folks to think about a figure like Bishop G.E. Patterson within the context of Black study. And we often think about Black study in its most radical context, which embodies a critique of the Black church,
Which it needs.
right? But not always an inclusion of the Black church, and clearly not the Black Pentecostal tradition. I mean, aside from, say, the work of Ashan Crawley, we don't think about the Black Pentecostal church in the context of Black study. Why was it important for you to make that claim and to bring those two things into conversation?
That's a great question. And I think because of how Black it feels to me. And I'll use, there's a moment in 1998 when Patterson is preaching for the presiding bishop's leadership conference, and he's preached one of his sermons, Hold On, Help Is On the Way. I look at that a couple of times. And before that, he kind of frames it. He's talking about in evangelistic terms, right? We have the opportunity to reach the world for Christ, right? In ways that were not always available. And so for him, one of the things he's talking about is, he says, in those parts of the world where they've only heard the European American voice, now there's a chance to hear African American voice, right? And so to me, that points towards a racial politics that is also a politics of sound. When you think about how bluesy and Black his preaching sounds, right? So talking about that as something useful and valuable, that's on Patterson's side. I mean, we could go into the, Patterson is a race man of his own kind, complicated figure like everybody else, but he's on the committee that plans to invite King, for the sanitation workers and so forth, right? So he's in it, in his way and in his time. But the reason I feel like Black studies has to contend with a figure like Patterson is not for the sake of a figure like Patterson, but for all the folks who have been keeping Patterson alive. Yeah. And that to me, right, Patterson's ongoing, I'm thinking about all the work people are doing about liveness and so forth, Kevin Kwashi and, the stuff we talked about already with Sadia and Shana, but the sense, right, that whatever sociality is, right, is not limited by the logics of sort of spatial temporal coherence, right, and the way that taps into, sort of Black ontologies, like whatever life is, right? And we Black folks love the ancestors, right? And so, like this kind of, the kind of resistance, right? Like that Black culture, that the African diaspora situates at this sort of ontological limit of life and death. Like I feel like the Patterson afterlife is an amazing example of it. And then, people like Louis Chutsoki and others writing about Blackness and technology. Right. And so Blackness, technology, sociality, the kind of, arrogant indifference to physical death as the end of anything, right? All those things to me are like urgent concerns before I mention music, right? Urgent concerns for Black study. And so I think that, the fact that it is Black Christian, Black Pentecostal, right, ought not, right, like place it outside the purview of folks interested, in studying Blackly, right? In fact, like it calls for that kind of interdisciplinarity, right? Like, I mean, it's a hard book to write. I had to read a lot of media studies and put that together with homiletics and Black stuff that ain't never been touched, together in the same place. And then do my little music theory stuff on the side. But that's what Black study is supposed to be.
Absolutely.
So I think this is why it's important for this project to be read. I teach a grad course at Yale, the Joint Program in Music and African American Studies, and so the seminar, the two required seminars. One is the study of African American music, and so I'm teaching that right now. And so one of the things I was doing when I was finishing the book was like, how do I want this introduction to be construed for the students who are going to read it as a required text in this class? What do I want them to learn about what I think these fields are and what kinds of subjects are available to them for analysis?
Got a big question for you. So I'm at an event at North Carolina A&T. There's, of course, the audience standing up to sing James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing It. And if we're going to be honest, the difficulty of singing that song publicly almost mirrors the difficulty of being Black in America, right? It's as if the Johnson brothers purposely made it a difficult song.
They gave us an assignment
to sing, right? But I'm watching the audience, and folks are just kind of mumbling because people don't really know the words and they don't know how to deal with some of those chord changes. And at the end of the event, it's the A&T alma mater, right? Nobody's really singing that whole thing. But in the middle of the event, the gospel choir, all young folks, start singing Total Praise.
Everybody knew what to do.
And it was just amazing watching that play out. And you know, I was having my own moment on stage, right? Because the song is what it is, right? Are you concerned about the continued translation of that tradition going forward when there's now so many more diversions, musical diversions, right? Including AI.
Oh yeah.
That are going to challenge the attention of young folks who, you know, very often see music as a commercial enterprise as opposed to a cultural enterprise, right? We hear it when they describe music as old. Mm-hmm. For them, that's commercial, right? Because you don't think about culture as old. You think about products as being old. Right. Are you concerned about, you know, the continued importance of this tradition?
It's a great question. I was looking at one of my students is working on a paper, and they were citing John Michael Spencer, who
that's a name.
Called himself Theomusicology, and he has this phrase in there that he calls the momentousness of Black music, right? And to me, that is my whole scholarly project. You know,
that's what we do.
All together, right? And whether we're talking about the vernacular philosophy that is the gospel imagination, or talking about, you know, the media theory that is couched in Patterson's musicality, that is what is at risk, right? With the, you know, the commodification of Black music in the imagination of Black people, right? Where it is alienated from its momentousness and becomes something that can become dated. Because as you say, how can truth become dated? You know, and if what we're talking about is the profundity, momentousness of it, then that implies a certain kind of endurance built into it. I would say, you know, I'm worried. But I'm also heartened. You know why? I think that the 47th administration, all the crazy chaos, we're going to have to pull on some momentousness.
Absolutely.
Right?
Talk.
And as has been the case, you know, with so much of the great Black creativity, and I'm not trying to do the whole redemptive Black suffering thing. I'm just saying, we didn't make the world be trash. Right. When it has been trash, we have been able to, you know, make some treasure out of some of it. And so I think that is going to be what drives some folks back to the archive. And away from the market.
What's next for you?
So I have a draft of a book on this idea called Digital Antiphony. So it's about, you know, Black music and social media. And trying to think about, you know, shameless theft I have carried out. You know, that TEDx talk you did like in 2009, 2010, or 11, somewhere. You know, like it's kind of the whole point. So what happens if I, as a card-carrying musicologist, take seriously the fact that Black music was social media before social media was social media, right? And so in a way that's kind of picking up with the question of like, how is Patterson's life meaningfully elucidated by his ad for life? The same thing is kind of like, so what happens if we think about the sort of music that reigns on TikTok and other places seriously in conjunction with this, and also try to understand how Black music was always already doing this and sort of funding and fueling sociality in ways that, you know, are technological. So I mean, I've been, you know, thinking about music as a platform, right? You know, like everybody know how to code or do all the kind of stuff to mess with the apparatuses, but on these platforms, the platform is music, right? That's the thing that folks approach with a practice technicity.
Right.
That's the thing that they manipulate and make. And so often sharing virtual space is built on sharing actual musical space, right? Collaboratively, collectively, sort of asynchronous antiphony, right?
I mean, that's why that versus format
exactly
resonated the way that it did during the COVID. You know?
Exactly. So I'm thinking about that, and so I'll teach a grad class in the fall that hopefully will let me kind of wrap up some of these ideas. And then I owe a press a biography of Mattie Moss Clark. And
yeah, we need that.
Yeah, and so I'm excited to learn about that. And I've done so many from the first book and the second book. I've so many times said, this is not a biography, you know. I said that so they would give me tenure. But now that I got it, the flip side is I have to actually learn how to write a biography. Because it's a different thing, right, than what I've done. And so trying to like really learn that genre and that kind of mode of investigation will be a challenge, a good one, you know, about ready for a pivot on that front. And I want to write, you know, for wide readership, right? Something that folks can read and you know, and enjoy.
Yeah. We've been joined today by Professor Braxton Shelley, Professor of Music, Sacred Music, and Divinity at the Yale Divinity School. He is the author of Healing for the Soul, Richard Smallwood, The Vamp and the Gospel Imagination, Oxford Press, 2021. And he joined us today to talk about his most recent book, An Eternal Pitch, Bishop G.E. Patterson and the Afterlives of Ecstasy, published by our friends at the University of California Press. Thank you for spending some time with us, man.
Thank you for having me. I've had a ball.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.